He's just saying, I told him what you did today. You cycled up here. He said, "Oh, it's very good. It'll keep you fit, keep your body going well." He said, "The world, everyone's getting lazier and lazier. They depend more and more on cars and other forms of mechanical transport." He said, "One day probably we'll evolve to the point where we have no legs, or our legs just shrivel away because we don't use them."
Could well be true. Yes, I was thinking about that the other day, how everything that's invented now is designed to stop us from using our bodies all the time. We don't have to get up and change the channel on the TV, use remote controls, and we don't even have to open doors now, they open automatically for us. And they wonder why there's so much obesity around, and it affects people's health so much. And I think that's one of the reasons, is that we've got this psychology of using the body is a bad thing somehow, and we've got to avoid it at all costs. How long is Luang for Liem
till the 15th. But next week he has a trip to South Australia and then come back. He has a brief trip to Sydney and then come back. So a little bit of coming and going.
Is he visiting a monastery in South Australia?
We'll visit the Thai temple in Adelaide and then take him to Kangaroo Island. To see a bit of nature. He's been to Australia so many times, I think about 4, this is either his 4th or his 5th visit. It's not just to here but to other monasteries. So he's seen a lot of Australia. We've taken him to Ayers Rock, and he's been to Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Perth, and various places in Victoria. Seen the penguins, seen the Great Ocean Road.
Seen more of Australia than I have.
All right, there's not a lot left. He's been to New Zealand before, seen much of New Zealand.
I'd be interested to know what he thinks about comparisons between Thailand and Australia. What strikes him about Australia that's most different from Thailand?
Says, of course, the geography, the landscape, some of the nature is different vegetation and so on. But people, he said, if you know how to contemplate and you're looking, say, a bit more deeply than just on the surface, the people are much the same. People everywhere are much the same. But on a sort of more superficial level, you might say some aspects of Thai society, he said, not so well organised.
Life's a bit more anarchic over there.
Not sure anarchic, just unpredictable, time and those sort of things. You've been to Thailand?
Yeah. I went for the 2 weeks a couple of years ago now.
To visit Damodara.
Damodara was a lot of fun. The thing that struck me, being Thailand being a Buddhist country, I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised really, but it seemed like a very materialistic society on the outside, with just the advertising everywhere and buying goods and pushing those huge billboards you see along the sides of the freeways, buy this, buy that. And it seemed to me a contradiction from what I'd imagined Thailand It'd be like being a Buddhist country and having that side of it as well.
So that's just the nature of the world. You get the good and the bad mixed together. He said if we didn't have the bad, then we wouldn't know what good is. So it's just the nature of society that there's many kinds of people in each country, in each society. Some of them are wiser or more virtuous than others. Some behave well, some behave not so well. And it's always the case, there's a mixture. Even the Buddha talked about this. He talked about divided society up, or people in society up into 4 main groups based on their ability to learn Dhamma, to understand truth and to live in a way that will be for the end of suffering. And there are those people who they just hear some words of wisdom and very quickly they understand them, immediately they understand them. Other people need to hear more often, but they will understand. Others take a lot of time, a lot of effort to teach them, to get them to understand what is right and wrong, good and bad, and so on. And then there's those who pretty much they just never seem to learn, kind of never change, never learn. But society it's always got this sort of spread of different kinds of people, different characters, different levels, you might say. It says it's normal when we go to a new place, it's always different from what we imagined. So the first thing that shows us is how our imagination it's just imagination. We can't possibly know somewhere we haven't been in advance exactly what it's going to be like, and our mind will always create ideas and perceptions about what we're expecting, but invariably it will not be how we've imagined. But when you go into a new place, the wise way is to go in as one learning from that experience, and if you meet with things, people's behaviour or aspects of that society or that place that are not so good, or you learn and you say, oh, I better be careful about this or avoid this, or I won't follow that example because it's not so good. But what is good one can learn from and take that on board. So one uses the experience of travelling in that way to gain knowledge and understanding, and also the overall conclusion one can say is, well, that's just the nature of the world. Wherever you go, like the physical landscape, it's not completely even. You have some low areas, some high areas, mountains, some plains. People are the same. People in their behaviour, there's some people who are very excellent and inspiring and do good things and we can learn from them, and then there's some people behave in not good ways and we can learn from that in a way, well, I won't do that, I won't follow that. And that's just the way of the world. Wherever we go there'll be the highs and lows or the ups and downs of people and societies everywhere.
Just as our experiences in life too are through the highs and lows, it's never-ending journey through life.
He says life is not always what it seems at face value. So for example, say in the world sometimes we might look at other people and think they must be very happy, particularly say people who we might consider successful, maybe wealthy or with a lot of power and influence, or people with large sort of business interests and a lot of material wealth. We might on the outside think, oh, they must be very happy because they're so successful. But if you get to know them often you can see, well, it's not as easy or as straightforward as that. Sometimes they live with a lot of fear, a lot of worry based on having a lot. It can be a cause of suffering as well. It's not an easy sort of or necessary that they will be completely peaceful and happy, but just because they've got that outward success. said in the time of the Buddha there were people like this. There's one very famous monk who was a disciple of the Buddha called Mahakassapa, and before he was a monk he came from a very wealthy family, and they had a lot of business interests, and particularly a lot of land. They were farmers, landowners, and had other associated businesses. And you would think, well, he'd probably be very happy with that. It brought him a lot of wealth. He was able to choose a very nice wife because he was, sort of at the top of the pile, as it were. He could choose any wife he wanted. But he actually was not happy inside. He could see having a lot of wealth is burdensome. It's a cause for a lot of worries and concerns. The mind is never really peaceful because you're always having to think about all your business and the wealth and the things you've got. You can never really have a peaceful mind with that. So he came to the conclusion he'd rather leave that all, and he became a monk and left it all behind.
I assume he was happy with a monk. It's taken a while to adjust.
It says in life we often have to go through different experiences, experience different things and different circumstances before we realise what is the way to be peaceful. And, if you say in the case of he had to build up this wealth and his business interests before he realised, this is a burden, this is still a cause of suffering. And then he saw, this is what in order to be peaceful and happy, I've got to let go of this, give it up. Or in a more sort of mundane way, if you're hungry, that feeling of hunger will stimulate you to think, I've got to solve this, I've got to remedy this feeling of hunger. So you go off and you find food. And when you eat food you feel satisfied and that feeling goes. So in life we often have to go through many experiences before we see what we have to do.
I suppose the trouble is you spend a lot of your life doing it and you end up being pretty old before you finally see something. And most of your life is gone.
He didn't agree entirely. He said aging and the passing of time is just part of nature. It's just as it is. And part of this practice of understanding how to be peaceful, what is the right thing to do to be peaceful, is understanding the fact there are those things in nature that we can change and do something about and remedy. And there are those things which we can't, and we have to just learn to accept and be at peace with, because we can't change. So the actual process of aging, getting old, getting on, that's one of those, I guess. He says in Buddhism we talk about the four heavenly messengers, which are just aspects of life, of nature, that can teach us something. They're traditionally seen as old age, sickness, death, and the scene of a samana, say a monk or a holy person. And particularly old age, sickness and death, these are experiences that we all have to face, but most people and most of the time we don't really accept them into our heart or understand them as a teaching or come to an acceptance of them. We tend to resist them, we don't like them, we don't want them. So much of practice is just getting to see and know these truths as they are. It's just the nature of our existence as human beings. We must age, aging must come. We do get sick and eventually we will die. If we can do that, this is what will free us from suffering. If we can bring our hearts to accept that truth and just see it as the normal way of our lives as human beings. It's just normal. If you can see something as just normal, then that means your heart's accepted it, and one just carries on without suffering about that truth or that issue. Says the way to free the mind from suffering is to adjust one's way of viewing things so it falls in line with truth. We view according to truth. When we can see the truth of things and we can accept that, that takes away the heaviness of any experience. The heaviness meaning the suffering of an experience. Something you mentioned earlier I forgot to say is just like, say, if you're attached to something and you want to keep it and you haven't yet seen it as a burden, well, you'll keep holding on, but you might suffer in that way. They like pick up something like that, attached to it. After a while holding it, it gets heavy, but if you realise that letting go is actually going to be the cause of happiness, when you put it down you feel light, the lightness of having put it down. He was giving that, I think, as a simile, say like the attachment to the view, well, I want to live forever, to be healthy, not to get old, and so on. If you can just accept, well, it's the nature of human body to get old, and we must get sick, we must die. It's like putting down a burden. One just comes to accept that, oh, it's just the way it is. So it frees the mind from that burden.
I hear some geneticists talking these days about perhaps getting rid of old age, but they see old age as something in the genes which can be altered, and maybe one day we'll be able to get rid of it.
He thinks it's unlikely they'll be successful.
Well, they'll cause a whole lot of other problems by trying to do it.
Said the way the Buddha investigated truth and taught us to investigate truth or investigate reality is using the reflection on what we call the universal characteristics of existence, and the fact that all phenomena are subject to, they're all impermanent, they're unsatisfactory in their nature in the sense that they don't last, they're subject to change, and they're ultimately ownerless, without self, without a lasting self. And these three universal characteristics, if one keeps investigating them in one's experience, this is what frees one from delusion and brings the mind to peace and stillness and quietness by understanding or penetrating these truths. But generally scientists don't do it that way. Their way is based more just on thinking, what we call sankhara in Buddhism, meaning mental formations, mental creations. And there's really one thing about thinking is there's no real end to it. We're endlessly theorizing, thinking, and any kind of knowledge and study based on that doesn't come to a stillness or peace. It doesn't completely end one's mental proliferation. It tends to create more often, and it just continues the whole process. And they actually have a word for this. They call it sankhara mara. And mara is a word you can use in different applications. Sometimes it means something like the devil, or that which is evil, or certainly that which leads to suffering. So in this sense it's sankhara as an obstacle to peace, meaning one's mental formations, one's thinking, one's theorizing just doesn't bring one to peace. So his observation is that the normal way of science is like that. It's just leading to endless theorizing and thinking. It doesn't really bring one to true peace and coolness of heart in the way that the Buddhist path does. He said the way the Buddha, before his enlightenment, was thinking, he was sort of reflecting that in the world you have all these opposites. You have where you have day, you have night, you have light, you have dark, you have suffering, you have happiness, and so on. And you could see anything that is caught into that, birth and death as well, or arising and cessation, any physical or mental phenomena that is still subject to arising and cessation, say, is something that you can say, well, it's always going to be producing. It's unsatisfactory in its nature, as it's subject to arising and cessation. It's not going to be completely still, pure, peaceful. So the way the Buddha investigated that led up to his enlightenment was to try and find that which transcends birth and death, these pairs of opposites. Is there anything outside of that, something that doesn't get born, doesn't die, doesn't arise, doesn't cease? This was his way of investigation, and it's obviously slightly different from the way science goes normally. Science is still stuck very much into that which is formed, created by the mind, arises and passes away.
It's very much just stuck in the material world. That's what science is mainly.
The way the Buddha taught is to reflect on both the physical and the mental, contemplate both the physical world, the mental world, and use these three characteristics to apply to that, to gain wisdom. So it's, you might say, a very kind of complete teaching. Doesn't just focus on the material, say it's focusing on the mental and what's going on in the mind as you're studying the material, whatever you're doing, is also looking at your own mind.
Yes, it's interesting. Somebody was saying to me the other day, looking at human advancement over thousands of years, we've made incredible advances in terms of reconstructing the material world, building skyscrapers and spaceships and things like that, and being able to go to the moon and all this massive technology. Yet in terms of human relationships, we really haven't advanced at all from 3,000 years ago. We're still slaughtering each other. And there's been no advancement in terms of the human mind and how to connect with each other.
He said yes. He thinks most of what you call the evolution of mankind over the last few thousand years has been pretty much just material, technological and so on. And you can certainly see changes on the physical and material level, but then of course if the minds of people, the hearts of people hasn't really changed or developed much, then even with all the technological advances, the one using that technology is still often, say particularly when used say for war or harming each other, it's no different from animals, because the actual mind behind the one using is just the same as an animal if it's used technology say to harm or kill others, say. And this is what's lacking in the evolution of mankind, you might say, is a full understanding or correct understanding of the mind, the mental side of our existence. We haven't put enough effort into studying and learning from that, and we haven't seen that our actions, even though we are using our minds to create technological advance and so on, the mind behind a lot of those actions is still very basic. Sort of basic instincts of greed, anger, delusion, survival instincts and so on. The mind is still not particularly bright or lucid in terms of wisdom. We haven't really seen the path to peace yet. And so the result of that is that still in this day and age we do, like you say, we have a lot of confusion and conflict in the world. Everyone has a strong sense of their individual ego, identity, and so that leads to conflict and competition between people. You said just look at, say, what we've been talking about today. You have the sense of one country, Australia. People living here say, I'm Australian. I'm Thai. The people are living in Thailand. The people in America, Europe, all the countries of the world. Everyone, that's just one example of how we have our strong sense of self-identity, perhaps in this case related to the country we live in, and then that leads to problems, doesn't it? Nobody in Australia is just going to let somebody in America tell them what to do, or someone in Thailand tell them what to do. We have our identity, our self-identity, and that's associated with our country, and it leads to problems. We have disagreements between countries and groups of people. We have, we don't want to give in to some other group of people. We want to be independent and so on. And we can see on a daily basis all these sort of issues are still there in the world. We haven't transcended them or gone beyond them yet. He says that the ability to think, humans have this ability. There's nothing wrong with it in itself. We can use thought for many things. We can be creative, imaginative, use thought in all kinds of ways, but it's like a double-edged sword. It can also be very harmful. So we must be careful to train our minds to use our thinking wisely and for benefit. He gave the example of a young man in the time of the Buddha, Rattabala, who was from a good family, very loyal to his parents, and as a young man he had the assumption that he would get married and live in the world and have heirs, have children which would be heirs for his parents' wealth, and he would do his duty in that sense. But then he started to think, started to consider the truth. He heard the Dhamma teaching, and he started to consider the truth about things. And he could see that although that's true, we have that duty to start a family, have children, to continue the family line, and to build up our wealth and all that. At the same time, we're going to get older every day. There's nobody who doesn't get older every day. And what does old age or the aging process bring us to? It must bring us to death. What does death mean? Well, one thing he could see, when we die, we can't take anything with us from this world. So in that sense, we can't really own anything in this world. We can't really have or own anything, because when we die, we separate from everything that we are involved with during our life. And also his contemplation brought him to see that also everything in the world is kind of influenced and affected by everything else. And there's nothing that kind of exists independently as a self, as an entity, or any kind of lasting soul or self on its own in this world. Everything is subject to change, and it's what you might say is a conditioned thing, affected, influenced by other causes and conditions all the time, and subject to change. This was the kind of thinking that came up for him as a young man, which led him into the robes and became a monk. And it's something that we can consider for ourselves. These kind of reflections, they're not just something to believe in, they're something to take away and think for yourself and see, well, is that true? Is it true that we can't own anything in this world, everything is subject to change? Is that true or not? These are reflections that we have to use to bring our own thinking and view in line with the truth. What was that? Yeah, what was that?
The last reflection, the world is not never full, the craving.
Yes. The result of that, the fact that we can't really own anything, is a sense of lacking in the mind, in the heart. We can never have everything, hold on to everything, be completely satisfied with the world and what it gives us. So this is the effect of craving on the mind, or this stirs craving. We're constantly looking and seeking for more, seeking different kinds of satisfaction, but we can never find that, never find the feeling of completion or fullness. There's skillful communication and discussion, such as we're conducting now. It's very useful for people to learn, to receive information, exchange information, and learn and develop themselves. Bit like the study of mathematics. You have addition and subtraction, and you learn these skills so that you can use those techniques to get an answer, to get a solution to various problems and that you might have. But we also have to be wary of just the kind of desire just to learn and to know things for the sake of it. We always have to keep in mind that any kind of learning, personal development, any knowledge we gain has to have a purpose, and that is for freeing ourselves from suffering, freeing ourselves from greed, anger and delusion. It's not just to acquire knowledge for the sake of it, and because that can turn on us, it can actually become a source of more of a source of suffering than before. We can also lose track of what our original knowledge was and understanding of things which might have been quite good. If you just keep developing your knowledge, new ways of thinking, new ways of looking at things for the sake of it, or out of habit, then you can completely lose your grounding in what you knew before. You just keep developing further and further away from what was there originally. Or similarly with the development of the world, the way we are developing the world with the material side of things, technology, we are pretty much caught into this habit of constantly developing new techniques, new technologies, new ways of doing things, constantly researching and investigating to find that which is new, different, better than before. But if we don't also step back and look at that, we might end up leading ourselves into disaster, because all this development can also bring with it sort of secondary effects, side effects, unintended effects. Say with material economic development, well, there's things like pollution, the effects on the environment and so on. And you can see there's the possibility that what we might say is progress is actually leading us closer to disaster, and the end of the world is possible. So this is an aspect we should always look at when considering what is real progress and prosperity, whether in our own minds, our own lives, or as a general thing for the world.